Hello and welcome to another edition of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name's Ian Glacken. I'm an executive consultant for Snowden Optiro here in Perth, Western Australia. And today I'm joined by Dr. Gregory Zhang. Dr. Gregory is a senior geologist at Snowden Optiro here in Perth. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Ian.
So today, as a bit of background, Greg and I have been doing some resource audits, and one thing that's become of interest to us is this idea of declustering. And essentially there's two main techniques for declustering the data. So what I should say before we start is that the reason we're talking about declustering is that when we're comparing sample grades with block model grades, which you should always do as part of a resource validation, you need to decluster the data. Now, why is that the case? Well, the simple case is that when you're comparing raw data with, say, a kriged estimate, ordinary kriging will decluster the data inherently as part of the algorithm. So to compare that, you need to decluster the data, the raw data, the sample data. Now, essentially, there's two main methods, and I'll just mention them, and I'll get Greg to describe what they are. So the first method, or one of the two main methods, is cell declustering. How does that work, Greg?
Yeah, the cell declustering, basically, you set up a series of grades and overlay that on the samples, and then whether this to calculate the grades falling into each of the samples falling into each of the grade, and then give the different weight for the samples, and then by averaging that, every samples get played in this weighting or the declustering process, and it will contribute to the result.
So what are the uncertainties with this cell declustering? What are the key parameters that you need to think about when you're doing it?
Okay, I think the key parameters will be the cell size, of course, and then, as always, we would test a series of the cell size in all three dimensions, including X, Y, Z, and it can be rotated. But essentially, we're testing different combination of the cell size and to see how the global average will respond to the different cell size and see if there will be any trend in that.
Yeah, my observation is that when you're declustering a set of data, approximately 60 to 70% of the time, the grade will drop. In other words, as you apply a declustering cell size, your declustered grade will be lower than your raw grade. Maybe 5 to 10% of the time, the grade will actually go up. In other words, as you apply the declustering cell size, your grade will increase. And then maybe 5 to 10% of the time, you get a sort of random arrangement of results with cell size. And that's the most difficult one to deal with. What I should say, the implications of the situation where your declustered mean increases as you decluster the data, that means that as geologists, you're effectively concentrating your data in the low-grade parts of the ore body. So that's obviously not what we're trying to do. But it does happen. So one of the uncertainties, as Greg mentioned, in fact, the main uncertainty is A, the cell size that you use for declustering, and B, the declustered mean that you choose. Having said that, it generally, most of the time, it's quite simple to choose a declustered value. So that's one method, that's cell declustering. The other method is polygonal declustering. Greg, tell us about that.
Okay, so polygonal declustering, rather than setting up the fixed cell size compared to the cell declustering, in the polygonal declustering, we give it a different volume for each of the sample, and use that volume to represent the weight of that sample.
How do we define the volume?
In data mine, and what we would do is to use a constant cell size, and which we tend to make it very small, and then do the nearest neighbor estimation. And so ideally, every sample will be assigned to at least one of the blocks, so it can again play the role in this declustering process. And of course, there will be some samples which will inform a lot of blocks, and for those samples, it will get a higher weight for this declustering process.
Yeah, so the fundamental principle of polygonal declustering is that you would generate a polygon around each sample, and that polygon extends halfway to the next sample. Now, as Greg said, that's not easy to apply in a block modeling program such as Datamine or Vulkan or whatever. And the way that it's done, as Greg mentioned, is by creating blocks and summing the blocks up. But the theory is that you generate these polygons, and then the polygonal volume is used as the weighting factor. Now, one of the issues with this is this idea of extrapolating beyond the data and on the edges of the domain. At the edges of your ore body or domain, quite often you see some extrapolation, and that obviously varies depending on the various factors. But the fact is, if you have an excessive amount of extrapolation, then those edge samples will get a much larger declustering weight because the volume is larger, the polygon is larger, and that may introduce a bias into your declustering. So I guess the issue is that the theory of polygonal declustering is very clear and very easy to understand, but the practice is quite difficult. So recently, Greg and I are working on a project where we were doing some declustering, and the client who'd done their own declustering of this model, an ordinary Krieg model, they generated a nearest neighbor model, and they were using that nearest neighbor model in lieu of declustered grades. What's wrong with that, Greg?
There are a couple of things we find it's quite unusual. The first is this when the client uses the nearest neighbor estimate as declustered values, we find it matches really well to the ordinary kriging estimate. It's almost like a one-on-one relationship. So that makes us curious how effective this declustering technique works. And then the second thing is when we did our independent declustering checks, we find this is a little bit gap, and especially in certain areas we can see the constant trend or bias. So that raises our concern, and that's why we want to do a little bit more on this topic.
So the fundamental issue is that with cell declustering, every sample has a declustering weight. And the theory or the intention of polygonal declustering is that every sample has its own declustering weight. Now, when you generate a model, such as a nearest neighbor model, you're only using one sample per cell. And effectively, you're not using every sample. And if the block size is quite large, then you might only be using 20 or 30 or 40% of your samples. So in other words, when you're using a nearest neighbor model in lieu of a proper polygonal declustering weight, you're actually not using every sample in the declustering. And I think that was the cause of the discrepancy between the model that we used and or the declustering method that we used and the one that the client used. So how can you overcome this issue? What could you do to fix it?
I think one of the solution will be use very, very small size, small block size to do this nearest estimation, and then it becomes very, very similar to the polygonal declustering. And so theoretically, these two methods should be give you very similar results. And then if that is not practical, then you should try out different declustering methods and to see if there's any big discrepancies between them.
Yeah, so I think the message we're giving to you is, look, it's fine to use a nearest neighbor model in lieu of a proper or a true polygonal declustering model. However, you need to be very much aware of how many samples you're using out of the total data set in your nearest neighbor model. And if your block size is very large, then you're not using many of the samples. If you have a small block size, as Greg mentioned, it's much better. But then the problem with that is it takes a long time to run, right?
Exactly. And for most of software, you have a maximum limitation for the number of blocks you could run for the estimation. So when you test the small block size, it can easily reach that limit.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway message is that you do need to be a little bit careful if you're going to be using a polygonal declustering technique, and particularly careful if you're using a nearest neighbor model as the input to or in lieu of a polygonal declustering.
That's true. And the one thing to add on is it's always a good idea to use domain wireframes to constrain the polygonal declustering process, because that will help you control the extrapolations towards the edge or the end.
Yeah. So I guess one thing that we would practice is we would generate cell declustering, and then we've talked about the uncertainties and the biases associated with that, and we would also try and carry out some polygonal declustering given the issue with the block size, and we would compare the two. They may or may not be the same. To give you some comfort, you would expect that both of these declustering techniques would give you the same result. There is a third technique which is very complicated to implement. This is this summation of the kriging weight. So the idea here is that you estimate blocks and you sum the kriging weights that are ascribed to every sample during the estimation process, and then the sum of the kriging weights divided by the total kriging weights is the weighting factor for each sample. Now that is quite tricky, and it's not available in most software.
In Dynamite, I think there's a way to do that.
There is a way to do it in Dynamite.
Although it's a little bit complicated, is when you estimate into the blocks, there's one of the output option is to give the sample file out, and every corresponding to every block. It will tell you how many samples have been used for this estimation, and then each of the sample will have a kriging weights.
Right.
So after that, you can accumulate the kriging weights for each of the sample by every block, and that way you can get your kriging weights for your next step kriging.
Okay.
The declustering analysis.
Okay, so the message is it can be done in DataMine with a macro. It probably can be done in Vulkan. It definitely can be done in Asatis. There is a way of doing that. So you need to be a little bit careful. But I guess that the takeaway message is with the declustering, be very careful, and understand the limitations of each of your declustering algorithms.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, that draws to conclude a discussion on declustering. If you enjoyed that podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where we've got lots more of them, or have a look where all good podcasts are found. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Ian.